Good morning to everybody out there in Swuggaland. Now that the era of anniversaries is officially over and we have hit the 3 week point on Darth Vader, it means that we can talk about the numbers on the era as a whole in a way that is not disingenuous. If you remember when IG-90 came out, Arnold had posted a video talking about how the player base was shrinking and how eras were the end of the game and blah, 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 blah. And I had done a rebuttal referring to the differing timetables and the misconstruing of that data. And I had committed to looking at the timetables of those marquees for the rest of the era. And today we're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about veteran fatigue. And veteran fatigue has been a source of a lot of videos on my part and on other content creators' parts over the last couple of weeks. But now I want to talk about it through the lens of interpreting data from what we have for Era of Anniversaries, as well as data, well, tentative and limited data on the Era of Andor. So let's get started. And as always, if you enjoy this type of breakdown, do not forget to hit that subscribe button. But let's get going. Now, when we talk about the numbers for the Era of Anniversaries and for the Era of Andor, I do want to stipulate one thing right now is that we are trying to be as reasonable and non-sensationalist as we possibly can. Anytime we interpret numbers, we are making a prediction or making a guess, but our goal here is to better the game, not to induce a panic. And so, with that said, while I am obviously um, making predictions and I am obviously talking about patterns, I cannot feasibly say with 100% certainty that any one thing is true. I can only say, hey, let's look at these factors and see how it may be changing the game. So let's get into it, starting with our control group. And our control is Captain Silva, Forlom, and Zuckuss, because those are the three characters that came out right before Eras came out. It's really hard to talk about any characters before that because once we hit the timetables and days since release where characters become farmable, and especially now with era battles, those things are going to skew the numbers, and we can kind of see that happening here with Captain Silvo for the 7 stars and Forlom and Zuckuss because of multiple attempts on the era battles, which happen pretty much right away. But we can look at the overall unlock rates to get an idea of how big the player base was at that time. And from looking at Captain Silvo 93 days after release, we were looking at about 350,000 unlocks, and that remained relatively consistent for Forlom and for Zuckuss, right? We see about 337 for Zuckuss 33 days after release, and a growth of roughly 2.5 to 5% with Captain Silva when we see 2 extra months. Now, reasonably, previous to eras, characters weren't automatically unlocked, which does factor in. But when we look at 3 characters overall and the idea that era battles gave people free shards, there really wasn't any reason not to unlock these characters. And I do not think that the player base was largely much bigger than what we are seeing right here. And when the Era of Anniversaries came out, we saw number one, 10th anniversary. A lot of players were coming back, a lot of new changes to the game. It happens anytime there is a big patch in any game. But number two, CG did see a huge spike in their advertising budget. And we started to seeing much higher quality advertisements throughout the social media sphere, which was responsible for an overall increase in the size of that player base. So keeping that in mind, we look at our 3 week average on the Era of Anniversaries right here. And these are the numbers as of 3 weeks after a character releases. right? And this was the source of why IG90 was so divisive 1 week after his marquee had come to the game. But we see Stormtrooper Luke with 513,000 unlocks, a drop with IG90 to 485,000 unlocks. But if we look at all of the era overall, we are seeing pretty much over 500,000 people unlocking each one of these characters, which is a huge jump from the 350,000 that had previously unlocked the last three marquees at a 30 to 90-day rate window, as opposed to the 21-day window that we are looking at right now. Now, unlocks itself just tell us the story of the player base and how big it is, but it doesn't really tell us much about the spenders. And we can't really look too fully into the release control on the 7 stars and the spenders, because looking at those days since release, these characters had their era battles already come out. These characters, like Captain Silvo, had already become farmable. So that data is kind of inapplicable to us. But I can tell you anecdotally, typically a marquee would see about 2,000 to 3.5 thousand 7 star unlocks in that first week, just from checking, just from looking. But I'm not going to harp on that number because I don't have the evidence to back that up. With the Era of Anniversaries, starting with Stormtrooper Luke, we saw about 8,800 7 star unlocks pretty much right away in that first week, which is a huge jump. And while that didn't fully remain consistent, IG90 not being super popular at the 3 week mark, we did see numbers that are larger than what we can typically expect, jumping all the way to 10,000 for Darth Vader's Duel's End. I will say that Darth Vader's Duel's End was the character that people were most likely to 7 star just because of the Zarek materials, so that does make sense. But overall, those 7 star unlock rates are considerably higher than what we reasonably can expect. Hate Fueled Mall, we see 3,867 unlocks in that first week, and we're not going to see any more going forward until the rerun of that event. And why is that number so much lower than IG90, who is the lowest of all of those characters? It's because of that 75 to 85 jump where you are required to spend money, right? Feasibly 25, 50, 75, 100. We cannot expect most people to have 150,000 crystals laying around, so I don't think anybody unlocked a 7 star character with 6 marquees completely free to play. But we can reasonably expect that players have reduced their spending by by supplementing their crystal spending with cash spending and trying to get to Hate Fueled Mall in the old way, which meant, hey, you get all of these characters, you bring them to relics, you're fine, you don't have to spend anything additional. Levels 75 to 85 in the era do require spending. It is a hard stop. You must spend to get there. And that has turned people off to the bottom, where we are getting 3,867 unlocks as opposed to 5, 6, 7,000. Now, what does that mean for other journey guides? That's really hard to talk about, except I did go back into my coffers of Reddit posts that I've made, and I just so happened to make one around the time that Grand Inquisitor was posted. And it talks about the numbers on both Starkiller and Grand Inquisitor. I will say that Starkiller's 7 star unlock rate is just a prediction based upon the percentages of people in Kyber versus the other areas of the game, and predicting that those percentages remained relatively the same. However, my numbers for Grand Inquisitor are accurate as of right when his event ended, and giving .gg the time to calculate and populate its numbers. So for Starkiller, our prediction here was roughly 3,071 7-star unlocks, and obviously you couldn't unlock Star Killer below that. It was 7-star or nothing. And for Grand Inquisitor, it was 3,793. Now, Grand Inquisitor is the only one where we have hard numbers, and it does fall in line with what we are looking at for Hate Fueled Maul, which is not surprising to me just because CG did not give us this information about that 75 to 85 drop until around the time Asajj Ventress came out, which put people in the position of having that sunk cost fallacy spending and wanting to push through to the end. Will that go further into the Era of Andor? I'm not exactly sure. However, we can look at the numbers as of right now to kind of make a little bit of a prediction. But before we do that, because Clea has only been out for 1 week at this point, and it would be disingenuous to compare that against the 3 week numbers, we're going to pop on over here to another spreadsheet I made. And while I was not great at looking at numbers every single day like I had hoped, thankfully I did get the 1 week numbers on all of the characters except for Stormtrooper Luke, because we started this experiment when IG-90 came out. And if we look at those unlock rates, we are looking at a low of 411,000 and a high of 504,000, and a 7-star unlock rate that goes from 5,950 all the way up to 9,884. So still pretty big numbers overall. And I would say, looking at this, the average is somewhere around 440 to 460,000. Now, when we look at that 1 week number for Era of Andor and Clea's release, we are looking at 397,000 unlocks and 5,786 7-stars. This is a far cry difference from those 7-star unlock rates in 1 week for the Era of Anniversary. I do anticipate this number going up steadily and hitting above that 400,000 mark within the next week, 100% without a doubt. But because Coliseum is a premier game mode at this point, and because these characters do unlock pretty much automatically from the point that you log in and go into Coliseum, we can make pretty ideal predictions about the player base and where it stands right now. And there is a very clear retraction from the Era of Anniversaries. But before we talk about that, I do want to point out one thing, and we talked about this in the other video, and that is essentially that when CG did the 10-year anniversary push and when their advertising budget increased and they threw advertisements everywhere for this game, tons of new players came in. And during that video, we talked about the mobile gaming statistics for player retention. And in the 30-day running average for a game, you can reasonably expect that a new player is actually only going to stick around, or I should say that you can only expect about 5% of new players to stick around after the 30-day mark. So it is surprising that we were fairly consistent throughout the Era of Anniversaries, and it's not surprising that we are seeing a retraction here at all. What I am curious about, though, is whether that retraction of player base is going to continue on trend and we're going to see it dropping back to around where it was before. Do I think that that's going to happen in the Era of Andor? I actually think no, but I think that with this Era system, we are starting to head in that direction. We will talk about that in a minute. If I could make a prediction for Cassian Andor as a journey guide, I am going to say that his 7-star unlock rate after his event is over, looking at Hate Fueled Maul at 3,867, looking at Grand Inquisitor at 3,793, I actually think that Cassian Andor's numbers are going to be somewhere around 2.9 thousand to 3.2 thousand. And I would love for someone to remind me to look into that after the anniversary to see if I'm correct. But that is where I expect this trend to go, where the Era of Andor may have very popular characters, but we are not seeing players interact with them in the same way as with the Era of Anniversaries. And that is a little bit of a worrying thing if the trend continues. So why is this happening? Again, going back to the beginning of the video, we talked about something called veteran fatigue, and we are seeing a lot of veteran players starting to leave the game. That doesn't mean that money is leaving the game, because we have seen a lot of new money come within the last year. I do know a lot of new whales who feel like the Coliseum and Era game mode have helped them to push ahead, and it has given them a basis to play the game on the same level as someone who has been playing for 8, 9, or 10 years. But we are also seeing those 8, 9, and 10-year whales starting to become and feel disenfranchised, walking away and taking their money with them. I have know of multiple content creators within the last week. Rabid Beaver, one of his co-hosts, I believe, just left the game. Stero, the Berm, Pico Burrito just left the game. There are a lot of these players who have been playing for a very long time and who have spent a very decent amount of money, who are feeling a little bit jilted by the fact that they are now being asked to spend more money in order to get the same thing out of the character as they were before. And not just with the fact of saying, hey, there is a price increase, but with this obfuscation of pricing and saying, hey, you have to get this character, but then you need to buy this currency, and then you need this other currency to get the currency. And these currencies you can spend crystals on, but these other currencies you can only spend money on, except when you can spend only crystals on them. But at the very end, in order to get the character you were getting before, you're going to have to spend about another $200 on a currency that was going to magically appear out of thin air, and there is going to be no more options for you. On top of that, Coliseum as a game mode is something that is very flawed, because we spend money towards it and we get excited as there is an increase and we start to see the path and say, hey, these strategies make sense. But then it resets back to the beginning. We all start from square one, and we need to do that ramp up again. It's like starting Path of Exile at the end of a league, getting yourself some really great equipment, and then finding out 3 weeks later that that league is over and you need to start all over again if you want to play with your friends. It's not exactly fun, unless it's something that you expected, anticipated, knew was going to happen, and were okay with originally. On top of that, we go back to the idea that players just want to play with their toys in the way that they want to play with their toys, and Coliseum is incredibly RNG dependent. Just yesterday, I was playing against the two bosses, those stupid tiger things or whatever they are, the obese tigers. And on my first try with Clea at level 44, I hit 35% damage, which was really, really nice. And on my second try, I hit 7% damage because they targeted Clea, because the RNG just didn't like me, because the debuffs just didn't hit, because she's not a leader and I don't have a leader in the leader slot and I'm just hitting buttons. It's not fun. So what are the solutions here for this? One major solution, and one thing that I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend to CG, is reduce the level that you need in order to unlock the journey guide character at 7 stars. Bring that number down to 75 and people will be okay with it. And I know what they are thinking, but Egnards, we did that on purpose because we want to make more money for EA, because we need to make more money for them, because capitalism says that the numbers always have to go up, and that's a whole nother story. But the reality is that we haven't actually lowered the cost of marquees at all. Those marquees are the same price that they have been since the Jar Jar era. And just the currencies existing alone is increasing the revenue to CG. Players want their era currency. Players who spend a lot of money want their era currency. Those players are spending to bring their characters to level 30, to level 40, to level 50 in the the first week, in the third week, in the seventh week. They are participating in era currency, but because they feel like they don't have to and they want to. With that level 75 to 85 hurdle, players are feeling like they have to spend in order to get what they were already getting before, and that the increase in price is just too much, not because they can't afford it, but because they don't want to afford it and they feel like it is a miscommunicated thing and that it is unfair to them as a player. I promise you, CG, that right now, while revenue may be really, really high, if we average that out over the next three eras and then we look at dropping that number to 75, I promise you, you will see an uptick. You will see people spending again who are veterans, but you cannot wait. Waiting for that to happen, players will have already left. They will already feel like they are outside of the game ecosphere, and they are not going to want to come back at that point. And that is problematic. I have seen players who are whales. I have seen players who spend lots and lots of money DM me saying, hey, this is the final straw for me. The other side of that is the time commitment. CG, I will tell you that in this last era, in the era of Andor, you did an amazing thing by taking the marquee battles and making those marquee battles simmable. And that is awesome. And I love it. And it is such a positive change. But realistically, it is such a small time saver when you are consistently asking us to spend more and more of our time in game, and not just in game, but also outside of game. I don't want to get too big into the Datacron controversy right now with the 1 month shift from the 2 month shift, but that alone is causing players to have to interact with resources like .gg and research and their spreadsheets a lot more than they've had to in the past because the system is moving much faster. And for a mobile game, that already tells me that I am spending way too much of my time, 2 to 4 hours a day playing it. Anytime you ask me to spend more time playing it is frustrating. CG, outside of this 75 to 85 controversy going on right now, we really need to look at shoring up the time commitment of players. Rise of the Empire, Relic Delta. We were told, hey, this is going to speed you up. It does not. It materially does not change battles for players at the levels where they need them changed. We need to look at this game mode that takes so much time, and we need to say, how can we reduce in half the amount of time players are spending doing battles that they have already done dozens upon dozens upon dozens of time on auto. Looking at those types of things right now will go a long way towards bringing players back and making veterans feel like they are heard and willing to spend their money. I know that as a consumer, I have the money to spend on frivolities. I have the money to spend on things that are luxuries every once in a while, but I am more likely to spend when I feel heard, when I feel communicated to, when my time is respected, and when I am having fun. And when all of those things come together, I will throw my money at you. But right now, those veteran players are saying, hey man, CG, we are having trouble. The numbers as the numbers as we look at them do not lie as to what the player base is seeing right now. Do not forget about us. Do not just chase that new money and say it doesn't matter if these veterans play because we have all of this new money coming into the game. Because there are ways. There are ways to make both groups happy. There are ways to make eras work for everybody. There are ways to make your player base not feel like the best option is to walk away from the game. And I'm here to help. Reach out to me. Let's talk about it. There are some very, very smart people in this community who understand that you need to make money. who understand capitalism, who understand that this is a business, but who also understand that this is a game first and foremost. With that said, folks, I'd love to hear what you think. Drop it in the comments, that's fine, or on Discord. Join us on Discord and let me know. I always love having an intelligent and reasonable conversation with adults who are willing to talk and who are willing to listen. Peace out and have a great rest of your day.